Oh, good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you who are watching on video, we're back from spring break here on the Penn campus and looking now today in particular at the proposals that the Obama administration is putting together dealing with climate change. For a long time, the complaint, at least about many other parts of the world, was that the United States didn't have a set of serious climate change proposals. Well, that problem, the degree to which it was a problem, has now been solved by some very aggressive initiatives that the Obama administration has put forward. But all the reasons why it was so difficult to do it for so long are now becoming clear because there are a lot of important sources of opposition that are beginning to surface as well. And so what we're going to be doing today is to look at what the Obama administration is proposing to try to see what the basic issues are that underlie it, and then to assess the odds that Obama and his team are likely to be able to solve these in a way that will put the United States in a different kind of position leading up to the Copenhagen round. And just to give you an idea what the answer is it's very hard to tell. The issues are extremely complicated on the technical side, and the political landscape is incredibly complex as well. So we're going to be looking at some of those things as we go through the class today. But first, let me try to lay out what it is that we're going to be talking about, and then what the Obama people are exploring. We want to look at the Obama energy proposal first, some of the issues, as well as what the prospects are likely to be. So the first point, the Obama proposal. After a long time of the Bush administration working its way around the problems and puzzles of climate change, the Obama administration has now just a very aggressive effort. As you'll recall from previous discussions, what the Bush administration had argued initially was that it wasn't clear that climate change was an issue that really warranted a large and sustained federal level attack, and that if there was a governmental policy, we have to be very careful to make sure that the policy wasn't so expensive that it really caused an enormous hit on the economy, that it didn't slow up the rate of growth of economic development in the process. In the course of the Bush administration's tenure, bit by bit by bit, the Bush team gradually began to embrace the idea of climate change as an issue as the science became more clear. But then in the effort to try to figure out what to do about it, it was just not certain on its own about what kind of strategies made the most sense. Barack Obama ran for the presidency on a campaign promise of trying to do something very significant dealing with the climate, and in terms of its policies, to develop a cap-and-trade kind of policy that we'll explore in a little bit more detail today. The McCain campaign had also developed a cap-and-trade plan, but again, as we'll see a little bit later, it was a bit less aggressive in its reach and especially a bit less aggressive in its application of market principles. And so we'll be exploring some of those things as we go. What is it that Obama's proposed? First thing is he's proposed it. He's proposed it quickly, made it part of his budget, and did it in his first 60 days in office. That in itself is, for those people who criticize American presidents for not following through on their campaign promises, at least something that's worth notice. It's very clear that they intend to do something significant about climate change. The proposal is as follows. First, that the plan overall is a cap-and-trade plan. And I have a short video that I'm going to show in just a minute or two that attempts to explain what that is. But we've explored some of these issues previously. What a cap-and-trade plan, in essence, is to put an overall ceiling on the amount of pollution that would be allowed, and to allow trading to encourage the most efficient applications of different kinds of technology to meet that cap. And so it's a cap-and-trade plan. Second point of it is a fairly aggressive effort to reduce the amount of emissions. Starts with emissions in 2005 with the goal of reducing emissions by 14% by the year 2020, and with a further reduction of 83% by 2050. And so the scientists will be debating whether or not that's too fast or too slow, but it's pretty aggressive. And it's an effort to try to do what it is that the United States would need to do, in the Obama administration's eyes, to be a world leader in the effort. Third thing is that the entire economy, the entire nation, would be subject to a cap on emissions. And so essentially nobody would escape. There would be an effort to impose this cap on the entire economy and force everyone who operates within it to devise strategies to try to reduce the amount of emissions to meet that cap. That there would be prices that would be established. in addition to trying to meet the cap, there would be a price, an initial start for the market that would be created. That would be, according to the administration's plans, $20 a ton for the amount of, essentially, the right to pollute. So the administration, if you remember our previous discussions, would start by essentially creating a property. They would create something that doesn't now exist, which is a economy-wide right to pollute that would then be licensed, and the licenses would be sold at a rate of something like $20 a ton. And the administration's policy would be to have the federal government recapture all the money that was raised. And so in previous discussions, you'll remember, there was not only what to do about creating a property that doesn't now exist and then creating a market in which that property would be bought and sold, but it would also create public ownership of that property so that any of the proceeds from the sales would go to the government itself. This is something that would happen through an auction process. As we'll see later, there are lots of discussions about whether or not the auction, that is this market, ought to apply to everything, but the administration's proposal is to really make this a full, complete market test where there would be no efforts by the government to interfere with the way the markets operate and where the amount of money that would be raised would be pretty significant. The amount of money would generate, by 2019, the administration estimates $645.7 billion, which is a pretty serious amount of cash by any standards. What would they do with the money that they're raising? In part, to invest in clean energy, in part to finance a tax credit for workers who might be displaced, and in part to offset higher energy costs for lower and middle income people, and also some small businesses that might have disproportionate impact as well. So the idea is to create this property, to create a market in which the property would be bought and sold, to recapture the profits from that market, and then to use some of those profits to be able to help subsidize the disproportionate impacts of this policy change in some individuals. So that, as some people would argue, this is a tax that would be very regressive, that would hit poorer people the hardest, and the administration proposes to use some of the money that it's raising to try to offset the extra costs for energy that would be borne by lower income people. So that's the plan. It is pretty well thought out, although there are a lot of issues that still need to be resolved and a lot of holes that are still in it. It is very aggressive in terms of the targets. It is heavy in its reliance on the markets because everybody who's interested in engaging in the economy has to engage in this process of buying and selling. And it's an effort to try to get at the targets very quickly.
Come up with this $20 a ton.
And the question is, where $20 a ton? That was the estimates of the administration's experts on what the initial market was likely to be. Because it's hard to, when you start looking at the amount of emissions that come out of smokestacks, it's hard to even see that in terms of tons of stuff. But there's a lot of junk that goes up. And so it's fairly easy to monitor the amount of emissions that are going on, that are being produced. And their estimate is that $20 per ton would be the initial market price.
Some economists.
It's economists and policy experts who are engaged in this. It's their guess about where the market would start. So, what do we think about this? Let me play two things, one of which is from an environmental interest group that explains essentially what cap and trade is and how it would work, and then another one from Fox News that describes some of the sources of opposition that are already starting to emerge. So let me play those things. This is from the National Wildlife Foundation, the National Wildlife Federation by Jeremy Simons. Assuming I can make this work.
It boils down to technology innovation and the marketplace working to protect our environment while growing our economy. As heat-trapping gases build up in the atmosphere, they stay there for decades. So we have to think ahead and set clear goals now for reducing emissions. A cap-and-trade plan puts a limit on the total amount of these gases that can be released by industry. The limit gradually gets lower and lower over time, so industry is emitting less and less. That limit is the cap in a cap-and-trade plan, and that's what reduces pollution. The trading portion of a cap-and-trade system is the key to the economic success of this approach. The program provides flexibility to every business to determine the best way to reduce pollution. Companies that lead in innovation and can reduce pollution with clean technologies and concepts will profit. Companies that have a harder time reducing pollution can lighten their load by paying other companies to make even deeper pollution reductions. In short, the cap-and-trade plan favors the marketplace instead of heavy-handed regulations. It's a simple common-sense solution where the science determines the goals, businesses innovate and become cleaner, and the marketplace allows companies to minimize their costs and profit by doing the right thing. Cap-and-trade has worked before. It worked in the 1990s when we dealt with acid rain. The first President Bush put in place a program to reduce pollution and ended up reducing pollution by 40% at about 1/10 the cost.
It's time for a new kind of environmentalism, driven by the knowledge that a sound ecology and a strong economy can coexist.
It worked because of innovation. It worked because of, essentially, at the end of the day, companies made a profit by doing good by the environment.
So the interesting thing that is at the core of this is first an argument by a pro-environment interest group in favor of cap and trade. It's a simple explanation about how cap and trade would work with a cap over the economy to try to reduce the amount of pollution. And you can see with the animation, the cap gradually gets lowered. It creates a market between people who pollute, companies that pollute, to create incentives for those who have the easiest time or the most economic ways of being able to reduce the pollution to be able to do so and to be able to get an investment in exchange for that. It's a way to try to solve some of the political issues as well by saying it's against heavy-handed government regulation by relying on private markets. And so it's both a policy strategy and a political strategy to try to address some of the questions that previously had tied up a lot of environmental efforts to try to deal with climate change. And finally, it's an effort to try to embrace the former President Bush, or perhaps the former President Bush, and what the administration then had proposed as a way to try to deal with acid rain issues, which in fact it had made significant progress. And so in a very short video, it's an effort to try to explain why what it is that the Bush administration now is talking about can make some sense. Not everybody agrees, however. And let me play something from Fox News that illustrates some of the issues that are at the core of all this.
The budget director is also trying to sidestep criticism over an environmental policy which he and the president admit will result in higher energy costs for consumers. Chief Washington correspondent Jim Angle looks at cap and trade.
Almost every activity in the U.S. economy emits carbon dioxide, but President Obama wants to impose a cap on total emissions throughout the economy and charge industry a new tax of at least $65 billion a year for their current activities.
There's an overall limit on pollution that's set for the economy. Then each company has to purchase an allowance that allows them to emit some pollution.
The emission permits would be sold at auction, putting a price on emissions in hopes of creating a financial incentive to find alternatives.
Companies that can reduce their emissions more have to buy fewer allowances.
But even candidate Obama conceded during the campaign that plan would hit consumers hard.
Under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket.
Skyrocket, he explained, because utilities, especially coal, would have to pay an enormous price up front while they search for ways to reduce emissions.
They would have to retrofit their operations. That will cost money. They will pass that money on to consumers.
Several analysts confirm the president's prediction and say the increases in utility costs will be steep.
In dollar cost terms, probably an additional $700 to $1,400 per family per year, starting around 2012.
Which is why President Obama would redirect some of the $646 billion tax increase to help people of modest incomes pay higher utilities. OMB Director Peter Orszag made clear tax breaks those groups now get would no longer be a net tax cut, but rather aid to offset higher utilities.
That's one reason why we are linking the cap and trade program to making work pay, which is a tax credit for working families that would provide relief in their budgets over time.
But those tax cuts phase out at $75,000 in income. What about those between $75,000 and $250,000 who would also face higher prices for everything from utilities to gasoline? A question that came up today in a hearing with the Treasury Secretary.
My question is, what Americans won't end up paying more for virtually every item they purchase because of this higher tax on energy.
You can't address the problems presented by climate change or dependence on foreign oil without changing the incentives people face for how they use energy.
So it's the price we have to pay in the administration's view, but as the debate unfolds, there are lots of questions about whether that price is too high.
So, if you listen carefully to the critics, the argument is that the price, in fact, may very well be too high, that the price for individual consumers or for each family may be somewhere between $700 and $1,400 a year, according to some analysts, that families that are now already struggling to make ends meet would have this additional amount of burden to be able to pay for without anything that they're going to have to be able to show for it, except for an improvement in the environment in the very long run. And so the battle lines are clearly drawn. The battle lines between those who argue that the administration's cap and trade plan would enhance and increase the amount of cost that society would have to bear in exchange for, yes, benefits on the economy and benefits for the environment in the long run, but without anything in the short term to show for it. And the consequences, therefore, of trying to figure out how to balance the short-term costs that are clear in exchange for the benefits in the future, which may not be, are one set of the issues that opponents to this proposal are already beginning to hold up, and it's one of the things that makes passage that much more difficult. Now, the administration has made very clear that we'd like to move this, like to move it quickly, like to move it before the Copenhagen round of negotiations starts, but already there are warning signals, even from Democrats on Capitol Hill, that the odds of having all that happen are slim because of the considerable amount of opposition. Let me try to explore some of these issues as we go, to try to talk about what it is that's going on. The issues have to do first with the cost to the economy, second with the different impacts that this proposal would have in different regions of the country because it doesn't affect all parts of the country equally. The third is that there's some people who are simply opposed to the idea of a full auction, even within a market-based approach. And then finally, the last point in terms of the big issues, whether or not we're talking about increased costs without a certainty that emissions would in fact be reduced. The only thing that opponents argue that would be worse than having short-term costs in exchange for long-term benefits is short-term costs in exchange for no benefits. So we'll explore each of those things in turn. First, the cost to the economy. As I noted earlier, one of the major sources of opposition to a more significant and more aggressive climate change policy came from the Bush administration with an argument that by imposing extra costs on the economy, what you would do is just simply slow down economic growth. And there are those who say on top of that, that especially now with the world economy in general and the United States economy in particular, struggling with the incredible burdens that are coming with the economic slowdown, that now is the last time you ought to think about adding extra costs to the economy, extra costs for energy to every family's bill, extra costs that would inevitably slow down the rate of economic growth, extra costs that would make it that much harder to create new jobs to try to create and substitute for the jobs that are otherwise being lost in the economy. The real source of opposition, first and most fundamentally, is that this is in a sense, tax increase on individuals to try to pay for, in the long haul, an improvement in climate. Many members of Congress agree with this point, and so a large source of opposition to the administration's plan is coming from Republicans who are still carrying the Bush administration's banner, arguing that climate change, even though it now may be something that we clearly have to deal with, when dealt with under a cap and trade that would appeal and would apply to everyone, would impose enormous costs that everyone would have to bear and would increase the cost that everybody would have in trying to simply deal with the business of trying to deal with the business of business. And that families in particular have to dig much more deeply into their own pockets to try to make sure that they can actually pay for the utility and energy costs that would come along with it. The basic argument in a nutshell is this, that the cost, as they quote Obama himself during the campaign in saying, the cost of a cap and trade system is that the cost of energy would go up as, on the one hand, energy producers and pollution emitters would have to pay for this right to pollute. That would then be added onto the energy bills of individual consumers. That would drive that up. and that at the same time it would increase the cost of companies who are in the process of trying to figure out how to comply with the cap and trade regulations, and would drive up the cost of their goods as well. So the first argument against this is that it simply would drive costs up, and at a time when the economy is already struggling, now's not the time to impose extra costs. The argument the administration's made in exchange, of course, is that the revenues that would be raised would be returned in part to consumers, especially to poorer consumers, to help them pay for the extra cost of energy. That would certainly happen. But they argue that while the government might take money out of the left pocket, it would fill it back up into the right pocket for at least those who are in the position of needing the most help. That is not a very much consolation to Republicans, who would call it a tax increase, have called it a tax increase, will always call it a tax increase, and use this as a major source of opposition. Because in a nutshell, Republican opponents don't really trust the administration or Congress to make good on this promise, to make good on an effort to try to put money back in people's pockets. So that's the first argument. The first argument is that this is essentially a tax increase. Tax increase may be well-meaning to try to deal with climate change, but it increases the cost to consumers, and increasing the cost to consumers would take money out of the economy, hurt job production at a time when we can least afford it. It's the first question. Next one. Regional impacts. This one actually splits the Democrats. As if the president's proposal didn't have enough difficulty from Republicans, there's substantial opposition from many Democrats. And the opposition from the Democrats comes from the fact that a basic point of a cap-and-trade system, which isn't obvious at first blush, is it affects different parts of the country differently. If you're a part of the country that, for example, produces coal, and companies, and power companies in particular, have a disincentive to use coal to create and to generate electricity, then that's going to mean a loss of jobs for coal miners. If people have to pay more money to burn coal because coal is putting carbon matter into the atmosphere, that's going to add to the extra cost for those who live in those areas, and they're going to have to pay more. For those who have companies and manufacturing facilities in those areas where energy production may come disproportionately from old generation coal-fired power plants, they have to pay for electricity to make their cars, to make other pieces of machinery, to make other kinds of goods. Their cost of production will go up because the cost of electricity will go up. And so the argument is that for some parts of the country, especially the traditional manufacturing bases, and for those parts of the country that are involved in coal production, that this is going to disproportionately hurt their part of the country. That rural places that rely heavily on energy, places that are heavily involved in manufacturing, places that are heavily involved in coal production, especially old-style coal production, would be hurt. And so there are Democrats who are beginning to stand up, argue that they have to be counted, are beginning to say, yeah, not so fast. Let's think carefully about this, because the risk is that in the race to try to reduce the overall level of carbon emissions, we run the risk of seriously damaging the economies in some parts of the country. That's not the case for all parts of the country. Parts of the country that produce relatively cleaner coal will be better off because their coal will be in higher demand. Parts of the country that rely more on service industries will be better off, and they'll be in higher demand. Parts of the country that have an easier time meeting the emission requirements and standards will be better off as well. And so one of the things that is important underlying all this is an often neglected fact, which is that a cap which is designed to put a cap over the overall economy doesn't affect everyone equally. Some parts of the country will have to pay higher costs. Some parts of the country that worry about job losses are going to be disproportionately affected. Some places of the country are going to be paying relatively higher electricity premiums than others because of the cap-and-trade policy. And this is just simply unarguable. Now, is this a solvable problem? The answer is, well, yes, because if you're going to take some of the profits from the government's sale of these licenses to pollute and return them to taxpayers, you can direct it at the people who are going to be disproportionately affected. So there's a way to be able to solve those problems. But for members of Congress who are standing up and looking at this very carefully, It's one thing to say, well, yes, we'll take care of providing the subsidy later, but it's very difficult for people to embrace the idea of subsidies later in exchange for clear costs now, because there's a certain lack of trust about being sure that those things are actually going to happen. So the Republican Party has a source of opposition because their argument is that this, in fact, is a tax increase that's going to be imposed on citizens and constituents and consumers everywhere. And some Democrats are opposing this as well because their argument is going to hit their districts harder than others. Not universally, but it's also often the case that the Democrats whose districts are most likely to be affected by these arguments are also relatively conservative and moderate Democrats who the Obama administration is already having difficulty keeping inside the fold. And so the problem is that these are the people that the administration can least afford to lose and runs most of the chance of offending in the process of chasing after this one particular policy goal when it's also trying to herd them into other things at the same time. So the problem of trying to keep the Democrats inside the corral at the same time that they're being asked in some cases to embrace a policy that may disproportionately affect some of their districts is itself a difficult problem. That's a second challenge that the administration has to face. A third is the idea of full auction. We're now getting into some of the technical aspects of this, but it's a very real piece. There are some who embrace the idea of cap and trade, like John McCain, for example, who don't believe that, in fact, we ought to have a full auction for everybody. What John McCain, in fact, argued during the campaign was that some permits should be given away instead of sold to help offset the costs that some industries, especially some of the industries that have the highest costs of compliance, are likely to have. And so the idea, for example, is that there are some smaller investor-owned utilities that produce a substantial amount of electricity, who often are dependent on higher carbon-emitting coal and other sources of fuel that emit lots of carbon, that would have a disproportionate cost, have a harder time trying to raise the capital to engage in the transition. And so the argument here is that there's some people, some places, some industries, some areas that simply would be hit much harder than others who are going to have a more difficult transition period to this era of a cleaner environment. The administration would argue put everybody underneath the same cap and have everybody engage in the trading, but there are some, including John McCain, who argue that what you really ought to do is keep some of those carbon credits in reserve and give them to some industries that are going to have a harder time, a more expensive time, a more difficult time trying to reach the cap, so that it would be dispensed as a matter of a privilege and right as opposed to a matter of the market. This is really a tough question because for those who enjoy seeing some of the world tied upside down, we have some Republicans arguing against the idea of full market competition, and some Democrats, like Obama, arguing in favor of a complete reliance on the markets. Usually you'd expect the Republicans to be arguing in favor of the market and the Democrats arguing for intervention. This is a case where things have been flipped. Things have been argued in reverse, in part because there's a different pattern of winners and losers, also in part because it's clearly the case that McCain and other Republicans in particular simply believe that some players in the system will disproportionately be punished by a full market-based cap and trade. And so they want to start out by making sure that some of the companies that are going to have the hardest and most difficult and most expensive transition costs have a little bit of help at the beginning. That they don't have to not only figure out a way to hit their emission targets and stay underneath the cap, but that they don't have to pay extra in addition to that for the right to pollute or to engage in very expensive trading to be able to buy the credits that they need. And so the argument is, for those who are going to have an especially hard time, give them the credits, sacrifice some of the revenue, make sure that they get some of the benefits that they need to be able to get into the game. Obama, in contrast, however, says that, a market's a market. If we're going to allow the market to work, we need to get involved in a process that simply doesn't have the market messing with the market, the government investing in the market all the time. What we want is the government to create the market, stand back, allow the markets to work. So we have this, as I said, paradoxical argument that the Democrat is making the argument in favor of total reliance on the market, and some Republicans arguing for governmental intervention in the market for fear that the market itself would punish some people much more than others. So there's an argument here about whether or not, if you allow a cap and trade system to work, okay, we established the cap, but how much trading should there be? And how much governmental help should there be to try to help those inside the system adapt to it? There's another argument as well. And that argument is that you can fight all you want about the trading, but there are some environmental policy experts who argue what really matters is the cap. You can have whatever market mechanism you want, but the real question is how the cap is set and how fast it's lowered. The real question is how much in the way of emissions are you going to allow, how much are you going to bring those emissions down. Reformers, some reformers in particular, really say, you can do whatever you want, give the credits away, sell them, subsidize some, have markets for everything, do whatever you want, whatever it is politically that it takes to sell it. What really matters in the eyes of some people is creating that cap, capturing everybody, ratcheting it down quickly enough to produce enough progress against climate change. So what's really interesting about this is that we have an argument that is based on an argument, as we saw in the Fox News clip, of stepping away from traditional government regulation, imposing standards to something that's much more market-based, but then a question and a debate about how much to allow the market to operate and how much the market itself is going to be able to get everybody to where they want to go, and how much ultimately we have to try to put reliance on the cap and how fast it comes down. So the paradox, the irony, maybe the ultimate question in all this, is the fundamental question about how much we rely on markets, how much we rely on regulation within cap and trade, how much of it is the cap that matters, how much of it is the trading that matters. And there's some fundamental philosophical disagreements on how much emphasis to put on the cap and how much to put on the trade. What's right? We don't know. We have some experience, but not a whole lot of experience on these markets. As we've seen in some of the previous readings, the jury is very much still out on the question of where and how best to try to create strategies for making this work. But just to repeat the point that I made earlier, there's at least, for those who enjoy irony, the irony that it's the Democratic administration making the strongest argument in favor of the market, the trading, and Republicans making the strongest argument in favor of the cap and government intervention in the way the market operates. As we begin the serious debate over whether to go forward on this, the ultimate political compromise will depend a little bit on how we work out this balance between the cap and the trade. How much we're going to set and rely on a very tough set of standards overall, and how fast we bring them down for what the overall level of pollution ought to be, and how we'll create the mechanism for the trading in between. Very much an open question. Next point is an argument that some Republicans are making that is a kind of why should we bother with this kind of argument. Some Republicans are arguing that they say if you look at what's happened in Europe, they would contend, and we'll come back and explore this in a couple of weeks, that the European Union has in fact had cap and trade policies. They argue that yes, in fact, they have had caps, they have had trading, but the overall level of emissions has, they argue, been negligible. What point is there, they say, in going through all of this and imposing a lot of extra costs on the economy, running the risk that, in fact, we're going to drive up the cost for consumers and, they would argue, drive up the cost for American manufacturers, especially when other countries haven't as aggressively stepped forward, and so American manufacturers would be at a disadvantage with their trading partners in exchange for nothing. Some of this is an echo back to the question of the relative importance of caps versus trades. The response to some people to this is, well, these markets are still in their infancy and they're working out things, and the European markets have had some difficulties, to be sure. Forget the emphasis on the pure trading approach and put much more attention on the cap. And if you set the cap and ratchet it down, you're guaranteed to reduce the amount of emissions. Others say, look, it's just going to take time, allow the markets to work. But the very fact that the argument emerges here, yet again, raises yet again the question of how much weight to put on caps and how much weight to put on trades, how much weight to put on new market mechanisms and how much weight to put on more traditional regulations, and whether or not the whole thing is even worth it to begin with. Because, and this is the ultimate Republican argument, why bother to do it if it's not going to produce the kind of results that you need? Very interesting puzzle here that lies at the core of much of what the Republicans are countering here. Let me look at a couple other things, too, before looking at what the prospects of this might be. We've talked so far mainly about some of the opponents to the administration's proposal and some efforts by the administration to fight back. Not everybody is an opponent. General Electric, for example, a major American company which has been in the electricity business for a long time, but which now is increasingly also in the alternative energy business as well, thinks that this cap and trade thing is a pretty good idea for two reasons. One is that they think that they could make a serious amount of money by creating and selling and bringing to market alternative energy proposals that would allow companies to be able to meet the cap by engaging in more efficient methods of energy production. And so from the point of view of GE, they see tremendous opportunity here, as well as the fact for a company that's heavy in the energy business, what they would like is at least some certainty, some set of ground rules. You remember a few weeks ago we said that one of the big problems that a lot of companies have with this climate change debate is that it's very hard to engage in long-term planning for 5, 10, 15, 20 years if you don't know what the rules of the game are. Many companies, no company really wants to spend more than it has to on anything, but companies would at least like, if they're going to have to spend more money, be sure about how much more they're going to have to spend. Companies would at least like some base of certainty because that way they can plan. Most things that companies buy that they use to make things with have long lives. There are power companies that are out there now that have been producing power for the last 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, 50 years in some cases, using the same basic investment that's been modified over time. If you're buying something, you're hoping it's going to last for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you'd like to at least know what your cost structure is going to be so you know what kind of investments make the most sense to make. And so the challenge for a lot of companies is give us some certainty about what's likely to happen, and some companies think this is just a great idea because they see tremendous opportunity in the creation of green jobs and being able to market low carbon emission products and materials and equipment and energy sources in the meantime too. The people who are in the alternative energy production business, wind power, solar power people, think this is wonderful. There are those who are increasingly arguing, and it's one of those things that in many ways got very little attention in the American presidential campaign, but the Republicans in particular continually came back to the question of nuclear. And there are those who argue that it's going to be very hard to meet these energy reduction targets without growing reliance on nuclear production of energy. And the nuclear industry loves this proposal because the tighter the caps, the easier it is to make the case for investment in nuclear energy. But it's very hard to make the case for investment in nuclear energy without some certainty that the market is going to be there over the longer term. So they're part of the, let's get it certain, let's make it tough. That way we can sell things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to sell. To be able to make nuclear work, however, one of the things that we need is an answer to the question of where to put the spent nuclear fuel. One of the things about nuclear energy production is that in some ways we've worked a lot of the kinks out of the nuclear system, but it has two problems. One is that you've got to be very careful about what you're doing because you're messing with some stuff that can be very dangerous if you let it get out in the atmosphere. You don't want to let nuclear reactions occur in a way that the radiation can leak outside. And on top of that, when you're done with the fuel that's inside the reactor, you've got to do something with it. Nuclear fuel, before it goes into reactors, can be handled relatively easily. After it's been in a reactor for a few years, is so radioactive that it's lethal for 10,000 years. and trying to figure out, and by the way, 10,000 years is longer than the recorded history of life on Earth. And so we haven't even been writing for 10,000 years, but we've got to find someplace to put the stuff.
With that, if it's a long recorded life, why did the EPA just come out with the whole 10,000 years is too long, is too short of a time for us to use Yucca Mountain? I'm just confused with that whole...
Yeah. And the Yucca Mountain thing is a fascinating question. For those of you who haven't been following this, Yucca Mountain, one of the great experiences of my life was standing on top of Yucca Mountain in Nevada. I was on a commission to try to advise the Department of Energy at one point about what to do with stored nuclear waste. And the plan was to go out to the Nevada test range where they used to literally set off nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, and then later to bury them deep underground and blow things up to make sure they worked. And they said, we already own the land. It's a long way from anywhere. And I'm here to tell you, if you want to see desolation and isolation, go stand up on top of Yucca Mountain where you can look in all directions and not see anything except more mountains for a very long distance around. And so the plan was, let's go deep into the mountain and bury it, and bury the stuff, put it in a set of casks, and lock the door. And just not put a sign out front saying, don't open for 10,000 years. Or more. They actually let out a contract to figure out what kind of sign to put out in front so that if Martians landed in 7,000 years from now, that you would say, whatever you do, don't open the door. And so they engaged in, and we spent billions of dollars to try to do this, and the nuclear industry, electric power companies around the country have been paying into this fund for a long time to try to make this facility available. The decision's now been made for two reasons, not to store the stuff at Yucca Mountain. One of the reasons is that the current Senate Majority Leader is Harry Reid. Harry Reid happens to be from the great state of Nevada, and the Senate Majority Leader doesn't like the idea of having everybody's nuclear waste trucked to his state, which is 100, and put in a place that's 100 miles away from Las Vegas, the largest city in the state. The other argument is that there's still technical questions about whether or not that in fact is safe. This is a fairly stable area, and in fact, when I was standing on top of Yucca Mountain, the Department of Energy people who were taking us around were talking about how stable the area was, and then a week after we left, there was an earthquake just not very far away that broke some of the windows in one of the buildings we had been in. So would it have in any way disrupted the waste stored underground? Probably not, but the combination of groundwater rising and the stability of the geological formation for 10,000 years raises lots of questions about whether or not this is a good idea. The problem is, however, that if you have nuclear energy, you've got to put the waste somewhere, because just having it sit around is not a good plan. It's dangerous, and it can create an attractive target for terrorists who could then take it and reprocess it into something that can be used either for dirty bombs or nuclear weapons.
Is it safer in one spot rather than in many spots across the country?
And one of the other arguments about it was exactly that. Is it better to have it all in one place where you keep an eye on it, or to have it scattered around? The current plan, because there is no plan, is that if you're running a nuclear power plant and the fuel is spent, you put it in a shed out back. Or you bury it and you have it deep in water.
That's what they do now.
What they do now is just keep it scattered around. If you produce it, you got to store it. With the government's promise that 20 years ago we were going to take it and put it someplace, but we haven't been able to make good on that promise. There's a continuing argument about whether or not it's better to have it all in one place. We have one group, namely the U.S. government, keeping an eye on it, storing it, putting a sign out front saying, don't open the door, or whether it's better to have it scattered around. In a political sense, nobody wants it. If you were to take a vote, everybody would agree that it's better to have it in one place as long as it's not in my place. And Nevada, one of the great attractions of Nevada is that Nevada has one member of the U.S. House and two members of the U.S. Senate, and so it's easy to outvote them until they got their majority leader. So there's an attraction in having it all in one place, and you find the right kind of geological formation, you put it all in one place. There are those who argue that it's easier and safer just not to have to transport the stuff around, just keep it where it is. So there's still a big debate going on. The French are dealing with this in a slightly different kind of way, in essentially putting the spent nuclear fuel inside glass inside in this very complicated process. It takes it and encases it in a kind of glass component that then makes it a lot easier to store. You can pick it up, you can move it, you can insulate it, you can cool it, you can do all the things you need to do with it in an easier kind of way. And the French have been experimenting with that because, as you know, the French rely on nuclear power far more than any other country in the world, so they've had to try to figure out how to deal with this. Well, the people who think, you know what, I got an idea for dealing with nuclear waste. I could design better nuclear reactors. We could rely on better nuclear reactors in the process as well. The people who have an economic interest as well as a scientific interest and a policy interest in nuclear think that this cap and trade thing is a great idea because they see it enhancing their ability to be able to sell their goods. What we have here in a very interesting kind of way is the fact that this policy strategy that the Obama administration has put forward to try to create a cap on the amount of carbon emissions and then to create this market has tremendous amounts of political reallocations, political redistributions. There are some very big winners, like nuclear, like solar, like wind, like people who have relatively cleaner coal, like people who have industries that would produce fewer carbon emissions, and some big losers, people who are heavily reliant on carbon-based energy and who would have to pay the extra cost of trying to meet these targets.
Is there any way to combat the fact that there are these big losers, like for instance coal companies? You know, if coal is not the main source of creating electricity in America anymore, what happens to all the coal companies as well as all the people and jobs? For instance, New York Times has a new section on green energy and green business. There's an article that just came out that said, like, nobody really knows. They think that maybe the job losses in coal industry would offset the job gains in green industry, and therefore this whole idea that the stimulus package is going to increase jobs through green energy is not really that formidable. Is there any solution to that problem?
The question is there any kind of way to get out of the relocation question? There are projections about the relative job gains and job losses. There are those who say, yes, coal is going to be hurt, but there's going to be all this gain that's going to happen through green industries, and maybe even more. Maybe we'd be better off with the transition. And given the fact that coal production and coal burning coal mining is a very dangerous occupation, and burning coal produces lots of carbon, which makes climate change worse. So maybe, in fact, we want to encourage that kind of transition. On a broad policy level, in fact, that may make a lot of sense. The challenge, of course, is if you just happen to be a coal miner, it's not like you're going to be able to go down 3 blocks and be able to move into a green industry. The green industry's jobs that are being created may be someplace completely different. And so some of it is based on economic projections that are hard to know. Some of it is based on the fact that geographically, and in terms of the skills of individual workers, it's not a one-to-one switch. It's not that one person is going to go out and take a different kind of job. There are going to be some important transitional pieces that have to be managed along the way. So that one of the arguments is that, well, we've got a lot of money that's going to be coming in, and you use some of it to retrain workers, some of it to be able to compensate people who were lost, some of it to try to help the transition costs, and then you get into the question of how much you want to try to allow people to opt out of that, how much you give away some of these pollution rights right off the bat. Most of this has to do with not now the question of whether or not we need an effort to try to deal with climate change, but how we deal with the transition costs. And the transition costs are all about redistribution, from carbon-based energy production to energy production that relies less on carbon, from alternative and green jobs to old-style jobs that are more carbon reliant. Once you get people, as we are increasingly moving to the point where everybody agrees we got to do something, everything is about the process of transition. And the transition issues involve enormous amounts of really deadly serious political battles. Because it means, is nuclear waste going to be shipped to my state? Are you going to put my coal miners out of work? Are you going to help our wind farms? Are you going to help our solar production? So there are going to be some winners, there are going to be some losers, and trying to figure out how you create a game that changes the landscape of winning and losing is in many ways what this question of cap and trade is really all about. There are the economists and the policy experts who argue about this, and then there's a whole separate game that is completely about the balance and reallocation of benefits and costs and the transition issues along the way.
Congressmen from coal-producing states just basically have to accept the fact that at some point in time they're going to have to give up this industry. So is it just more of a question of how gradual you make the change with the cap question?
Well, first of all, there's not a single member of Congress from a coal-producing state that would ever say, we're going to go out of business. At least they wouldn't say it out loud. But if you're from a state that produces high-carbon coal, old style, old tradition, dirty coal, you know that there's a limited life because you're not going to be able effectively and efficiently to be able to do what you've been doing for a long time. Unless people can find ways of scrubbing the particulates out of the smokestacks, out of the atmosphere. That's possible. But there's at least that piece. But then you got to say, okay, if this is going to happen, how can I slow it down so at least the transition is slow enough and people in my district don't lose their jobs quite so fast? And the degree to which you can't slow it down, how can you make sure that the people in my district get benefits for job retraining, unemployment, and all the other pieces that come along with that? So it has to do with the management of how fast the transition occurs and how you try to backstop people who are losing their jobs in the process. But every time that somebody says, look, I'm from West Virginia and I need help because you're going to be taking jobs away from the people who live in my district, then people from other states like Michigan are going to be saying, well, yeah, that's true, but we rely on auto manufacturing. We're having a hard enough time keeping our car manufacturing in business. And you're talking about adding extra cost because it's a heavy energy use process. And so we need some extra money too. And pretty soon the line for subsidies gets longer and longer. So it becomes a matter of managing the reallocation and redistribution of the process and whether or not you can make enough money from the trading to be able to produce the subsidies that you want. And now you can provide the subsidies and direct them to the right places so that you don't spend all your time just giving the money to the people who have the loudest voices or the strongest representation.
So how long is this big overhaul expected to take, or how fast is the administration planning to?
And this is in many ways, how fast can we go? How fast should we go? Then becomes the core question. Because the climate change experts would say, and you've heard some of the scientists that visited the class already say, look, it's already too late. You read some of the readings early on saying, we now have to worry about now how to just simply adapt to the mess we've already made. We're past the point of being able to prevent it from happening, and we're past the point of being able to prevent it from having serious consequences. Now we have to try to manage the adaptation. So there's some scientists are already arguing it's too late to have to try to worry about how fast to move, because we have to move as fast as we can possibly move. But the faster we move, the more serious the short-term disruptions, the more serious the imbalance between winners and losers. The way to try to deal with that is to try to spread it out and provide subsidies. But the more you do that, then the harder it is to make improvements in climate change fast enough to avoid the consequences that climate change scientists are predicting. And so the real problem is that you can't ultimately rely on private markets alone to do this, because it's clear there are going to be a lot of dislocations and people looking to government to try to manage some of that. I mean, if you ask some climate change scientists how fast that you ought to move, they'd say 10 years ago. If you ask some people whose home state economies are going to be disastrously affected, they would argue from this how fast you should move. They would say 50 to 60 years. Climate change scientists would say we don't have 50 to 60 years. Those who are affected by it would say you can't destroy the jobs and careers and the economy of our states. And so what this in many ways is all about is the problem of trying to figure out politically how to work out the issues that come along with the scientific questions that are at the core of climate change.
As a follow-up to my earlier question, has there been any type of large-scale transition of this, of this scale to date that we could, look at maybe as a case study, or look to for guidance on how to go about doing this transition?
And the question is, do we have any experience? Has anybody gone through this kind of a transition before that could provide some evidence? And it's hard to look for this kind of transition, especially on this scale. We went from an agricultural society to an industrial society in the later part of the 19th century, but that was something that the markets themselves worked their way through for the most part. We had a transition to the information society after World War II, and especially in the 1990s, but that again was largely market-driven. This kind of significant change with government-driven policy is something that's pretty much brand new. And the difficulty and the challenge, and this is not only a philosophical, but a political, an economic, and a scientific question, is how fast, in fact, can we move given the amount of scientific and economic uncertainty about how to manage the transition, balanced against the increasing certainty that a failure to move quickly enough will have very serious environmental consequences. So the problem is if everybody agrees we've got to do something, and there's some agreement on what the something ought to be, the problem is figuring out how to build enough political support and policy strategies to get us to where it is we need to go. And that's, in many ways, for better or worse, as with many things about the Obama administration, even if, regardless of what you think about the administration's proposals, it's surfacing all of the central questions and just flooding them to the surface all at once in ways that make, in many ways, those issues inescapable. Beyond that as well, there are some very important questions here about just how this is going to work. There's going to be a market. Who's going to run it? There's a government agency that's going to have to be in charge of managing this market, and it's going to be a fairly significant piece. Somebody's got to simply be able to keep track of the overall level of pollution. Somebody's got to create the buying and the selling. We have a New York Stock Exchange, an American Stock Exchange, and a Chicago Board of Trade in the private sector that buys and sells stocks and futures contracts. Most people are anticipating some kind of governmental organization that's going to be in charge of doing this, but you got to simply be able to keep track of who owns how many rights to pollute. If the XYZ Corporation owns the right to 150 tons of greenhouse gas emissions, then somebody's got to keep track of that in some kind of giant bank account somewhere. And the process of creating the buying and selling has got to work. So that's one issue. As we'll see next week, the state governments have traditionally played a significant role in American environmental policy as well. One of the things that will surface out of this is what role states themselves will play in managing this transitional process, given the fact that some of this is about job creation, some of this is about creating green jobs, some of this is trying to sort out the basic questions of American federalism. And as we'll see next week, there are very big questions in all of this. And given all of what we just said about the fact that some states will be disproportionately hurt and others disproportionately advantaged by comparison to others, then you get into lots of interesting questions of state politics simultaneously. And then finally, there's the question of what happens if the United States delays. It's very easy, if you listen to all these questions and all these debates, to conclude that, wow, this is really complicated. This is very messy. And it's all happening at a time when the world economy and the American economy is in difficult shape, and where the idea of imposing extra complexity and anything that might raise even the slightest chance of slowing the production of jobs, whether it's true or not, will raise enormous amounts of opposition. It's in many ways, depending on your point of view and your strategy, either the very best or the very worst time to even be thinking about this. But then the ultimate question is, the Bush administration had very clear views on what should be done with Kyoto. The Obama administration came in with very different views about what ought to be done in Copenhagen. Can the United States go to Copenhagen without a plan? Can the United States go to Copenhagen as a leader unless it can find a way to get something like this forward? Now, the Obama administration came in and said, what we'd like to do is get this legislation passed before Copenhagen so that we can go with our plan already in law. And the Republicans are saying, we don't want this passed anyway, anyhow. And we've got Democrats are already saying, well, you know, this is an interesting idea, but we need to spend some time, we need to think about this, we need to study it, we need to allow the economy to recover. And some Democrats have begun to surface opposition in Congress as well. So the odds of being able to get this passed in time for Copenhagen now seem to be dwindling, even though the administration remains committed to it. So that raises the ultimate question about the prospects. Obama wants the bill this year. Democrats say, maybe next year, and the conservative Republicans are saying block it at all costs. So the question here ultimately is, given this is this hand of cards on the table, now in the American response to climate change, this is the central proposal, is there some opportunity for consensus that could in fact emerge from all of this? So what we'll be doing is looking both through your ideas and your projects that you're going to be working on to identify whether or not the strategy's here, but more broadly to look at some of these basic questions as well. Next week, we're going to be looking at the role of state and local governments in the United States on these issues. For those in other countries looking at this, the way in which our state and local governments play an important role in fundamental questions of national policy is often a puzzle. But when you look at the United States, when you look at American public policy, you can't look at any major issue of public policy without considering the role the state and local governments play as well. And so we're going to be spending some time next week looking at those puzzles in particular. So we'll return to those questions next week.